Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
This isn't a new problem, but it is one that is becoming impossible to ignore.
Concerns about the temporary foreign worker program have been raised for 2 decades, and following the critical UN report, the employment minister has vowed to crack down on abuse and is floating the idea of blocking companies from bringing in low-wage workers.
Criticism from a UN envoy that compared Canada's temporary foreign worker program to a modern form of slavery has put that program and its recent rapid expansion under the spotlight. And for a government that's already struggling with criticism of its immigration policy, simply vowing to do better probably isn't going to be enough. But why has this program expanded so rapidly? For years, temporary foreign workers were seen as necessary to Canada's agriculture industry. But now, somehow, it seems that they are also critical to our construction industry, to our restaurant industry, to our healthcare sector, and the list goes on. Is it really because there are no Canadians ready, willing, and able to take those jobs? Or is it because, to an employer, a temporary foreign worker is cheaper, has far fewer rights, and no ability to simply go get a better job? If the answer to that question is becoming clear, there's one more. What are we going to do about that? I'm Jordan Heath-Rawlings. This is The Big Story. Ghada El-Sharif is the work and wealth reporter at the Toronto Star, where, among other things, she covers the very program that is under so much scrutiny. Hello, Ghada.
Hi, Jordan.
Why don't you start, just in case people missed it last week, what did a UN envoy say about Canada's foreign worker program that attracted so much scrutiny to it, not that it hadn't been scrutinized in the past?
For sure. The UN Special Rapporteur on Contemporary Forms of Slavery didn't really hold back. He called Canada's temporary foreign worker program a breeding ground for contemporary forms of slavery, something he had already said last year during a 2-week fact-finding mission to Canada, and that was in August 2023. At that time, he said he was deeply disturbed by the accounts of exploitation and abuse shared with him by migrant workers. So pretty much a year later, he doubled down on those comments in a final report and really stressed that without offering these workers a clear pathway to permanent residency, the system leaves them vulnerable to exploitation. And that's because their status is tied to one employer when they come to this country, meaning that the threat of being fired and losing their status prevents many of these workers from speaking out against often abusive and exploitative work conditions.
Can you elaborate a little bit on what kinds of stories he's discussing when he says they're exploitative and abusive? And I know you've been on this beat a little while. Do any stories stick out in your mind in terms of the kind of things that can happen in this relationship?
He witnessed workers in jobs where they were overworked, underpaid, threatened, as I mentioned, with deportation if they spoke up. Personally, I've interviewed several migrant workers throughout my reporting who've shared deeply disturbing stories, including one migrant worker who was sexually assaulted by her employer's father while working in their home as a live-in caregiver and was fired when she spoke up, leaving her essentially without work or protection or a way to support herself. When a temporary foreign worker gets fired, they can stay in the country, but they just can't work for anyone else other than that one employer who just fired them. This is a common story I hear across all types of sectors where, for whatever reason, migrant workers are fired or threatened with losing their job and therefore their status if they say anything against their employer.
Let's step back just for a second, because I know this is a very broad term. When we say temporary foreign workers, what does that actually mean in practice?
Temporary foreign workers, or migrant workers, refers to people who come to Canada on a work visa that's tied to a specific job and an employer. So unlike permanent residents or Canadians, they're here for a set period, and it's usually tied to the length of their work contract, which can vary greatly from sector to sector.
What kinds of sectors, what kinds of jobs are we typically, if not always, talking about here?
The vast majority of temporary foreign workers come through the agriculture stream.
Right.
But most recently, demand has surged for jobs like food counter attendants, kitchen helpers, and cooks, and jobs in construction and healthcare have also seen a huge surge in the number of foreign workers hired in recent years. The original idea was that temporary foreign workers fill jobs that employers claim Canadians won't or can't do. So, as I mentioned originally, the program was used to mainly fill jobs in agriculture, but the program has rapidly expanded in recent years to fill positions in sectors like food service, healthcare, and construction.
And what kind of numbers are we talking about? Like, do we have a good grasp on exactly how many migrant workers are currently in Canada working these jobs today?
That's a good question. And it's actually a more complicated answer than you'd expect. The numbers have really shot up, especially due to pandemic labor shortages, which saw many Canadians walk away from low-wage jobs. In 2023, nearly 240,000 temporary foreign workers were approved to work in Canada through the program, which is more than double what it was just 5 years ago.
Wow.
And these are just approvals, though, which show that employers' demand for migrant workers has surged. But it's also important to note that there's other ways temporary foreign workers can come to Canada. We're talking specifically about the temporary foreign worker program, but there's also the International Mobility Program. At the end of 2022, there were more than 1 million active work permits in the International Mobility Program. And this group includes a range of workers, including company transfers from abroad. And those permits have jumped 193% over the previous decade. Also, international students can be considered temporary workers as well because they have temporary work visas here. So
Right.
there's so many different ways.
And what is the attraction? As you mentioned, there's no permanent citizenship on the table here. What is the attraction for these migrant workers? Why do they come to Canada? And why has this program surged in popularity?
So for many, it's about opportunity and the hope of becoming a permanent resident in Canada. Even though the jobs are tough and conditions can be harsh, the wages are often higher than what they could earn back home where there may not be opportunities at all. And a big reason for the surging demand is that Canada has been facing labor shortages, especially in sectors like agriculture, food services, and healthcare. Employers argue that they can't find enough Canadians willing to do these jobs, so they've turned to foreign workers to fill these gaps. And there's some truth to it. For example, in the agriculture sector, 40% of Canadian farm operators are expected to retire by 2033. But at the same time, critics argue that there's no such thing as a so-called labor shortage, and that the real issue is that these jobs come with such low wages, poor working conditions, and little job security, which makes them less appealing to Canadians. So instead of improving these jobs, companies are opting to bring in workers from abroad who have fewer options and are easily exploitable. As we see, a lot of these jobs that are filled by these workers are not temporary.
Do we know if what these companies are saying is true? I mean, you mentioned construction jobs, chef jobs. To your point, in the past, Canadians have filled these jobs. How do we make sure that employers are using the program as intended, I guess?
That's a tough one. There's many ways the government is supposed to oversee how the program is run. A lot of critics, though, right now, and advocates, labor advocates, are raising the alarm that because of these so-called labor shortages, a lot of the checks and balances are flying out the window. The allegation is that a lot of Canadian employers are relying on migrant workers to keep wages low, which is a huge deviation from what the original intention of this program was or is. And as I said, there is some truth to it, but with no pathway to permanent residency, there is this sort of second-tier workforce that gets paid less. The work conditions are worse than what most Canadians or permanent residents would accept.
What do we do about it then, I guess, is my next question. This is a government who, as we've covered on this show, is under fire for a lot of issues pertaining to immigration and our targets, including this program. Have they said anything about if the program's working as intended, if they plan to reform it, or what?
The government is talking about tightening oversight of the program to crack down on abuse. The employment minister very recently promised more stringent inspections and penalties for employers who break the rules. They're considering raising the fee employers pay to hire foreign workers, which could make them think twice, potentially, before opting for this route. But really, without the promise of permanent status, many critics say these are hollow promises. And without permanent status, these workers don't have equal rights to Canadian workers. On top of that, when companies can hire foreign workers at lower wages, it's important to note that it puts downward pressure on wages across the board and doesn't create incentive to improve conditions. It's a big part of the reason why labor advocates are pushing for better protections and a pathway to permanent residency for these workers.
How do we, to use a term I've seen around over the past week or so, how do we wean ourselves and our economy off of these temporary foreign workers? Because I've seen people claim that, without this program, Canada simply wouldn't be able to function in many sectors.
So the UN, through Obokata's final report, is urging Canada to provide all migrant workers with a clear pathway to permanent residency. And they argue that this would help end the exploitation by giving workers more security and the ability to stand up for their rights without fear of being deported. There is a growing awareness of the issues, and there is momentum for change, especially as more stories of exploitation come to light. But it's really important to clarify something here. Immigration and immigrants are not the problem. In fact, immigrants are essential to our economy and society, and this has been proven time and time again. The issue isn't that we rely on foreign labor, it's that we're relying on it in a way that's unfair and unsustainable. These workers are coming here, contributing to our economy, and filling crucial gaps in the labor market. They deserve the stability and protection that comes with permanent status. The solution isn't to necessarily stop bringing in foreign workers. It's to ensure that when they do come, they have the same rights and opportunities as anyone else. And so if we want to build a fair and just society, we need to stop treating these workers as temporary or disposable and start recognizing them as valued members of our community.
Do you get a sense from your coverage on the beat or from anything anyone has said in response to the UN's report that there is an appetite on behalf of the government to create a pathway to citizenship?
So there are some pathways, but they're pretty limited. A lot depends on the type of job, the worker's education level, and whether the employer is willing to support their application at all. And this can mean trying to get support from the very employers that are abusing the workers. But for many low-wage workers, it's just not a realistic option. There's an immense amount of resources and money and time required to get permanent residency, even for people who qualify very easily.
Are we coming to a tipping point where something has to give here, just given the rapid expansion of the program on the one hand and all the awful stories and criticism we're hearing about it on the other?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, there's definitely a growing awareness of the issues, and there's definitely momentum for change. The employment minister came out and made these remarks very recently, which also indicates that the government is aware of fraud and scams being done to bring in many of these migrant workers. Now, the issue is that they haven't really honestly made any promises for changing the program itself, but they've said they will apply more stringent oversight, which we hope will happen, but many critics say that it's just not enough. The system at its core needs to change.
Would it make a tangible difference if the government did just strictly enforce the intended rules of this program as it exists now? Like, I'm trying to get a sense, lastly, of how much of this problem comes from a broken program that needs to change, and how much of this problem comes from the fact that there has been so little oversight.
Again, many critics, many advocates, many economists I've spoken with over many of the stories I've reported on say that the system fundamentally needs to change. I mentioned that 40% of Canada's agriculture sector is set to retire very soon. These are the people who put food on our tables.
Right.
Who's going to work these jobs? So the system itself, which allows for the exploitation, the system which ties a migrant worker to one employer, fundamentally needs to change, which is what critics and advocates are saying, because that system is what allows them to be exploited, prevents them from speaking out against exploitation, and prevents also the workers that we need to stay here to remain in these jobs that no one wants to take. So fundamentally, and this is what the UN report said, the halfway measures that are currently in place are not enough. And permanent residency needs to be given to these migrant workers to protect them and to ensure that all workers have equal rights to walk away from an exploitative job, an abusive employer, and doing so would also ensure that employers increase wages, maintain good working conditions for everyone, not just migrant workers, for Canadian workers too.
Ghada, thank you so much for this. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me, Jordan.
Ghada El-Sharif, work and wealth reporter at the Toronto Star. That was The Big Story. For more from us, you can head to thebigstorypodcast.ca. You can talk to us anytime and give us some feedback. We got some great feedback from our listeners about last week's Fixing Canada series. Something tells me Joe and I will soon be sitting down to talk through that. But for now, if you want to get in touch, the email is hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca, and the phone number to leave a voicemail is 416-935-5935. Thanks for listening. I'm Jordan Heath Rawlings. We'll talk tomorrow.